Nostalgia is a moving target. The march of time doesn't stop. People are always looking back 20 or 25 years ago and hoping to recapture what they loved at that time. When it comes to video games, I actually think nostalgia has been a pretty positive force. People looking backward with nostalgia have revived dead genres and playstyles that had long been abandoned as not commercially viable. Okay, that same nostalgia also leads to a bit of a glut in some things. How many pixel art Metroidvanias do we need? But I still think that overall it's been a surprisingly positive influence, especially when you consider how toxic nostalgia can be elsewhere. Today I want to throw us back to the first wave of video game nostalgia. It was the late 90s, and for the first time people were really starting to look back at the early days of gaming and going, well, what can we do with this? Perhaps the most notable of these at the time was the mining of old Atari games to create new, more modern games based on them. But this wasn't something limited to the US. Japan was having their own retro phase, and part of that was this game, Celophans, a game whose title is very difficult to Google because it's a pun. It was developed and published by very small company 9 Lives, a company where I own half their output without realizing it because they only made 6 games. Celophans is a tribute to the late 70s and early 80s arcades. It's a collection of what you might call mini-games, but in that time period, they would be the amusements that you put your 100 yen coin into and played as a full game. There are 12 games in the Celophans arcade, and for the most part, they're not very good. I'll get into each game individually, but as a collective whole, they feel like the output of a third-tier arcade publisher. One that got by with copying better designs from other people, but never really managing to get them quite right. The title Celophans is a reference to cellophane, and how early black and white arcade games created color by putting layers of cellophane on the screen. And from that title you might think, I get what they're going for. But you don't. Only 2 games actually use the cellophane aesthetic. That feels a bit flimsy to base your title on it. The game selection is also surprisingly narrow. There are 5 games that are takes on Breakout, 2 games that could take some very loose inspiration from Space Invaders, 3 games that recreate electromechanical shooting galleries, and then the remaining 2 games are unique creations that could plausibly be arcade games from the first few years of the 80s. It's a selection of games for a very tiny range of tastes. There's a few more things to talk about before I get into the individual games. As you're playing those games, you're accumulating minutes, and you can use those minutes to buy enhancements for the games at the Akiba parts shop. I think the idea is that the arcade owner would be running down to Akihabara and picking up some aftermarket electronics to enhance the experience for players. Minor visual enhancements might only cost you 10 minutes of playtime, but for things that actually enhance the gameplay, you might have to turn in over an hour. Some of these enhancements can be turned off and on by accessing an operator menu by pressing L1 when you enter a game. After you select to play a game, you hit circle to insert a coin and start playing, and if you want to back out, then you press start and select at the same time. There's a fairly broad selection of control schemes, especially for the paddle games. You can use the standard PlayStation controller, in which case L1 and R1 in the game will cause your paddle to jump to the center of the screen and then keep moving. You can also use the PlayStation mouse if you like analog controls. Support is included for Namco's volume controller, which is specifically designed for block and paddle games. Celophans supports the DualShock controller, though I found that control scheme to be a pain to use. And for the shooting galleries, you can break out your Namco GunCon. Konami's Hyper Blaster is not supported. That's the control schemes. Time to get into the actual games. And I'm going to start with the creatively titled Computer Block. It's the most transparent Breakout clone. You've got a field of bricks, you've got a paddle, and you've got a ball. One twist on the formula here is that your paddle can shrink when it hits a block that's further up the screen. So if you're drilling deep into the stack, you're going to wind up with a very tiny paddle. There are multiple layouts, and you'll have to clear each one in turn. Computer Block is fine. It's nothing that's going to thrill you, but it's exactly the kind of mini-game that you'd expect in this type of collection, and there's really no major problems with the concept. I won't be able to say that about the remaining 4 Breakout clones. Next up is Sakai Ryoko, or Globetrotting. Here, instead of the abstract field of blocks, you have a pixel art version of a world landmark. There's also a little airport departure board that comes up between each stage to tell you where you're going next. Naturally, you have to take out all the pixels in the picture in order to advance. A real problem with this one is that because of the size of the picture, the blocks are effectively right on top of your paddle. You're going to have balls bounce off them and zip right past your paddle. And that's something you're going to encounter a lot in these games. Most of them are unfairly difficult. Some of that comes down to the control scheme not being great. I think if I had a volume controller, some of these would work a lot better. But there's a lot of just unfair design. The kind of thing that if you encountered it in an actual arcade, you'd go, well, this sucks, and then never put your money in that machine again. Moving on, there's a game that's just Sakai Ryoko all over again. Tono-sama Block, or Lord Block. Now you're smashing up pixel art versions of Japanese landmarks. There's also some very low quality speech samples mixed in there. Those are intentionally low quality, not the usual PlayStation low quality. The next one at least is something visually different. Delta is Breakout on a vector monitor. For those unaware, most screens that you'd find were raster screens. In other words, they drew their picture one line at a time, top to bottom. But some arcade games, and specialized equipment, used vector screens, where the image doesn't have to follow any particular pattern. The beam drawing the image can follow any path, turning off and on as necessary. The result is a striking image on the screen made up of glowing lines, tracing out polygons. Vector images made the math for scaling and rotation relatively easy, which is why you saw it used in things like Tempest. Delta doesn't really take advantage of that, partially because it's not actually vector graphics, but obviously the PlayStation 1 could simulate that fairly well. Delta is just aping a style without really using it. It's also a pretty bad Breakout clone. The ball has to go through the bottom line of each brick. That makes the sense of scale and position for everything feel really off. Also, for some reason, there's huge gaps between the bricks, and the ball can just pass right through it. It makes Delta just a less interesting Breakout with a worse perspective. That brings me to Dancing Zoo, the worst of the Breakout style games. Now there are a few things that could have been interesting twists. There's gravity applied to the playfield, for example, so the ball bounces in more of a parabolic arc rather than constantly rebounding off walls. The big problem here is that the ball will get stuck on terrain, bouncing around without ever doing any damage to it, and then suddenly get spit out in a random direction when it's really close to the bottom of the screen. For the other Breakout clones, after about 5 or 10 minutes of play, I was at least able to look at the second stage. Here, I never could make any progress at all. Maybe after you buy some parts to make the game easier. Mystery Planet is the only game with a story. You're looking at all of it right now. And in this game, you're given a spaceship with 1,000 points of fuel, and your goal is to collect all of the squares in numerical order. Usually there's 3 of them, on a few stages there's a different number. You can rotate your ship, fire its main gun, or activate the engine. And this is a physics-based game similar to Lunar Lander, although you're never actually landing anywhere. There's gravity pulling you down, and toward the bottom of the screen, it's a lot stronger. When you collide with the terrain or an enemy ship, then you lose 100 points of fuel. Run out of fuel, and your ship explodes. So it's a basic concept, but one that works pretty well. Navigating your ship around obstacles is pretty fun. I felt like it wasn't difficult enough, though. Either there's not enough enemy ships, or you have too much fuel, but I was just cruising through this game fast. The only way I was ever threatened was if I bumped something and started ping-ponging. This is a case where I think I'd need parts from the shop to make the game more difficult. Dragon Walker is the most difficult game on here to understand. It's kind of a maze chase, but not really. The important thing is, you're not trying to clear anything. As you walk around this grid, when you step on the dots, they'll change color. And if you can establish a square of a color, you'll get points. And naturally, you'll get bonus points if you can make multiple squares at the same time. You have the ability to jump, which will get you over dots, and to breathe fire if your fire meter has built up. The red is not the fire, it's the white. It feels completely backwards to me, but that's how it goes. You start out just turning the dots on by making them red, but then after you get enough dots, another color is added in, and when you walk on a red dot, it turns blue. Keep going like this, and other colors are added to the rotation. However, when the colors increase, so do the number of enemies on the grid. There aren't distinct levels here, you just keep playing as the difficulty increases. Dragon Walker is the most creative game in Celophans, but that doesn't mean it's especially fun. Something about the good score attack games, games where your only goal is to get a high score, is that they typically give you some kind of sub-goal. You want to clear all the dots in Pac-Man's maze. You want to get to Lady in Donkey Kong. But here, because it's all continuous, there's really no forward motivation. When I started out, I thought that filling everything in with the same color would be a good goal, but you don't get anything special for it. You just wind up stepping on the next dot and moving on to the next color. Dragon Walker feels half-baked. This game desperately needed something more. To follow that up, though, I've got my favorite game in Celophans, Sea Fighter. It's a very different take on Space Invaders. You're controlling the sub, and there's a ship at the top of the screen that you have to destroy. Unfortunately, there's a lot of sea life that gets in your way, blocking your shots. At the outset of a stage, the battleship, or I guess it's more of a destroyer outline. Either way, the ship at the top of the screen is the only thing that attacks you. If you get hit by any shots, then some of your oxygen drains away, but the oxygen is also constantly draining. So there's a time limit that also gets additional pressure when you're attacked. It's easy to avoid the ship's attack. The problem is, when you hit the sea life, they start attacking you. And the sea life around here is pretty tough. It takes a lot of torpedoes from your submarine to destroy one of them. So if you fire indiscriminately, you're going to have a very difficult time. And instead of just having one board layout with one enemy pattern, as you progress, there's a lot of different animals you'll encounter, each of which moves their own way, attacks with a different pattern, and is always giving you something new to deal with. Sea Fighter is a great twist on a common formula from those early days of the arcade. It's the kind of thing that I was expecting when I went into Celophans, and wasn't really getting out of the package. Carnival Hunt is another Space Invaders clone, but your limitation here isn't lives, it's bullets. You have a certain number of bullets when you start, and when you hit 0 it's game over. A straightforward shooting gallery style game. Except there are a couple of innovations here. First, you get more bullets by shooting the money bags that occasionally move at the back of the screen. Those will always be a high priority target for you. If you ignore a small target, there's a chance it can fly off the line when it reaches the far side, and swoop down to devour your bullets. Because they're going after your bullets, the ones that reach the right-hand side of the screen are a lot harder to hit than the ones that reach the left-hand side of the screen. From the left, they have to cross in front of your field of fire, while from the right, you have to rely on them chasing down your gun until they swerve back after your bullets. So small targets moving left to right are a greater concern than the ones moving right to left. And finally, there's large targets that will mostly block your shot, but if you shoot them 3 times, then you get big points. For the most part, I found them not worth shooting. There was always a higher priority target to deal with, and the cost in bullets was rather high. As you play, there's a progression of graphics as well, cycling through a few different styles of sprites. Carnival Hunt is decent, a nice little amusement, but not something I was really super into. And finally, I come to the electromechanical recreations. All 3 of these games are effectively exactly the same. A target slides up, you take a shot, and this continues for a while until the game's timer runs out. There are 3 different games like this. The worst of these is YY Jungle, and I'm not talking about the big game hunter theme. There's only 4 targets here. plus one European guy who you'll lose points for shooting. A couple of the targets have positions where they're just barely visible, though I never managed to actually shoot them in those positions. Gunfighter is more what you'd expect, a western town with one big shootout. There is a woman who appears in a window that you shouldn't fire at, but it's not like there's other targets around her that you'd be aiming at and possibly accidentally hit her. Just don't shoot at that window. And the final game is Tank, a World War II themed battlefield. This is the most interesting of these shooting galleries, with a lot of moving targets and some things that require that you aim at weak points. All of the shooting galleries are very primitive, obviously, and while they're reasonable recreations of what you'd see in the mid-70s, that doesn't really make them interesting. I kind of wish that they had done their take on Nintendo's Wild Gunman. The original machine used film, and that could translate very nicely to video here. And that's all the games in Celophans. I bought Celophans the minute I heard that there was a Japanese game all about recreating the 1970s arcade experience. And it was extremely disappointing in that regard. Even when I separate out my expectations there's a lot of bad games here, and there's too many that are just the same thing with different graphics. In an odd way, this might be relatively true to the 1970s arcade experience, where there were a lot of bad games that have just completely fallen out of memory. Nostalgia doesn't remember the hundreds of block-breaking games. But when I'm revisiting the past for entertainment, I'm not looking for accuracy. I'm looking for the pleasant warm glow of nostalgia. All of the cool things I remember, and none of the bad. I'm afraid Celophans doesn't deliver on any of that.